On the morning of the 16th of September 1992, the British government believed it was in control of the pound. By the time the sun set that evening, it had spent billions of pounds it did not have, raised interest rates twice in a single day, in a state of open panic, and surrendered to a group of people who did not hold a single seat in Parliament, command a single soldier, or answer to a single voter. They were traders, and in the space of one working day, they did something no invading army had managed in modern history. They forced the British state into full retreat, took its money, and walked away richer than some countries. This is the story of Black Wednesday, the day the markets went to war with the Bank of England and won. It is a story about pride, about a trap that Britain walked into with its eyes open, and about the single most profitable trade in the history of finance. But underneath all of that, it is a story about a very simple idea that governments keep forgetting and keep paying for. You cannot fix the price of money by decree. Sooner or later, the market will find out what that money is really worth. And when it does, it will send you the bill. This was not the first time Britain had gone to war over the value of its own money. A generation earlier, in 1967, a Labour government under Harold Wilson had fought for months to stop the pound from being devalued, insisting again and again that the line would hold. It did not hold. When the pound was finally cut, Wilson went on television and told the nation that the pound in their pocket had not lost its value. It was a sentence so at odds with what people could see in the shops that it became a national byword for political denial. The deeper truth of 1967 was written in plain sight for anyone willing to read it. A government can repeat a promise about its currency as often as it likes. The market keeps its own accounts, and in the end, it always collects. 25 years later, a new generation of politicians had either forgotten that lesson or persuaded themselves that this time would be different. It would not be different. It would only be larger, faster, and far more expensive. To understand how a nation lost a war in a day, you first have to understand the battlefield, and the battlefield was something called the exchange rate mechanism. In the years after the Second World War, the countries of Western Europe had watched their currencies swing wildly against one another. A strong franc one year, a weak franc the next, a lira that seemed to lose value by the month. For businesses trying to trade across borders, this was a nightmare. If you were a German company selling machines to Italy, you could sign a contract at one price and lose your entire profit before the payment arrived, simply because the exchange rate had moved against you. So Europe reached for an old dream, the dream of stable money. Currencies that held still against one another, so that trade could flow without fear. The exchange rate mechanism, launched in 1979, was the machinery built to make that dream real. The idea was elegant on paper. Each member country agreed to hold its currency within a narrow band against the others. Think of it as a room full of climbers, all roped together. Nobody is allowed to drift too far from the group. If your currency started to rise too high or fall too low, your central bank was obligated to step in, buying or selling to drag it back into line. And at the center of the room, holding the strongest rope, stood the German mark. The mark was the anchor. Germany had the largest economy in Europe, the most disciplined central bank, and a national memory of hyperinflation so deep that keeping money stable was almost a religion. Everyone else, in effect, agreed to follow the mark. For years, Britain stayed out. Margaret Thatcher was deeply suspicious of the whole arrangement. She understood something that many of her own ministers did not want to hear. To join the mechanism was to hand control of British interest rates to a committee in Frankfurt. It was to give up one of the most powerful levers a government has over its own economy. She resisted it for as long as she could. But the pressure inside her own party was relentless. Her Chancellor and her Foreign Secretary wanted in. British business wanted the stability. And the promise was seductive. Join the mechanism, tie the pound to the mighty German mark, and Britain would import Germany's famous low inflation as if by magic. The discipline of the mark would do what British politicians had never managed to do on their own. It would tame the pound. In October 1990, Britain finally joined, and here we arrive at the first fatal decision, the one that would set the trap. When you join a system of fixed exchange rates, the single most important question is the price. At what rate do you lock in? Britain locked the pound in at 2.95 German marks. And that number was too high, dangerously, catastrophically too high. A strong pound sounds like a good thing. National pride likes a strong currency. But a currency that is priced above its true worth is a slow poison for an economy. It makes your exports expensive, so the rest of the world buys less of what you make. It makes foreign goods cheap, so your own citizens stop buying from local producers. Factory by factory, order by order, an overvalued currency quietly strangles the industries that depend on selling abroad. Britain had chained itself to the mark at a rate its economy simply could not sustain. But for a while, nothing happened. The trap was set, but the jaws had not yet closed. And what closed them was an event that had nothing to do with Britain at all. It happened in Berlin. In November 1989, the Berlin Wall fell. Within a year, East and West Germany were reunited. It was one of the great triumphant moments of the century. But reunification came with a colossal bill. West Germany had to rebuild the shattered, bankrupt economy of the East, pouring in staggering sums of money to bring millions of new citizens up to Western standards of living almost overnight. All of that spending poured money into the German economy, and that flood of money threatened to raise prices. It threatened inflation. And to the German central bank, the Bundesbank, inflation was the one enemy that could never be allowed to win. So the Bundesbank did the textbook thing. To cool an overheating economy, it raised interest rates. It raised them hard, and it kept them high. Now remember the climbers, all roped together. Germany was the anchor. When Germany raised its interest rates, every other country tied to the mark faced an agonizing choice. Because money is like water, it flows toward the highest return. With German rates climbing, investors around the world wanted to hold marks where they could earn more. To stop their own currencies from sinking against the rising mark, the other members had to raise their own interest rates to match, whether their economies could bear it or not. And Britain's economy could not bear it. This is the heart of the tragedy. In 1992, Germany needed high interest rates to cool an economy running hot. But Britain was in the opposite situation. Britain was sliding into recession. Businesses were failing. Unemployment was rising. Homeowners were trapped in a housing crash, watching the value of their homes fall below the size of their mortgages. An economy in that condition is crying out for lower interest rates. to ease the burden on borrowers and breathe life back into spending. Britain needed to cut rates. But the exchange rate mechanism demanded that Britain keep them high to defend the pound's link to the mark. The government was being asked to press the accelerator and the brake at the same time, and every driver knows how that ends. The markets could see it too, and this is where the traders enter the story. Because a fixed exchange rate that everyone knows is unsustainable is not a wall, it is an invitation. To see why, put yourself in the position of a speculator looking at the pound in the summer of 1992. You are being offered a bet that is almost unfair in your favour. On one side, the British government insists it will hold the pound at its fixed rate. If it succeeds, the pound barely moves, and you lose very little, because a currency inside the mechanism can only travel within a narrow band. On the other side, if the government fails and the pound is forced out, it will fall sharply, and you will make a fortune. A small loss if you are wrong. An enormous gain if you are right. A bet shaped like that is barely a gamble at all, and the more traders who noticed it, the more irresistible it became. This is the hidden flaw at the heart of every defended fixed exchange rate. The moment the market begins to doubt it, the doubt starts to feed on itself, because everyone can see that the cost of betting against the currency is small and the possible reward is vast. The British government was no longer facing a handful of opportunists. It was facing the combined logic of the entire financial world, arriving at the same conclusion at the same hour. The people who accepted that invitation most aggressively worked for a man named George Soros. Soros ran a fund called the Quantum Fund, and he had built his career on a single, ruthless insight. Markets are not always rational. They are driven by human belief, and human belief can become detached from reality for a long time. But not forever. And the moment when belief snaps back to reality is the moment when fortunes are made. Soros and his lead strategist, a trader named Stanley Druckenmiller, looked at Britain in the summer of 1992, and they saw something close to a certainty. They saw a government defending a price for the pound that the British economy could not justify. They saw a currency held up by nothing but political willpower and promises. And they understood that political willpower, unlike gravity, can break. So they prepared to make a bet. But to understand the bet, you have to understand the weapon they used. The weapon was called short selling, and it is one of the most misunderstood ideas in finance. So let us be clear about exactly how it works, because everything that follows depends on it. Normally, you make money by buying something, watching it rise in value, and selling it for more than you paid. Short selling is the mirror image. It is a way to make money when something falls. Here is the mechanism. You borrow an asset that you believe is about to lose value. In this case, pounds. You immediately sell those borrowed pounds and convert them into a currency you trust, in this case, German marks. Then you wait. If you are right and the pound collapses, you can buy back the same number of pounds later for far fewer marks than you sold them for. You return the pounds you borrowed and you keep the difference. The bigger the fall, the bigger the profit. Now consider the scale. Soros did not borrow a few pounds. Through his fund, he built a position worth billions. He was, in effect, borrowing the British pound by the mountain and selling it into the market, betting the entire structure would come crashing down. There is a detail in how that bet was placed that has been retold on trading floors ever since. According to accounts from inside the fund, it was Druckenmiller who first concluded that the decisive moment had arrived and who proposed putting a large sum on the pound falling. Soros listened and then asked a question that has become famous in the world of finance. "If you are as certain as you say," he asked, "then why are you betting so little?" This was not, in his view, an occasion for a careful, measured position. It was one of those rare moments when the odds were so lopsided that the only real mistake would be timidity. He told Druckenmiller to go for the jugular. So they did. They did not merely lean against the pound, they threw the full weight of the fund behind the trade, borrowing and selling sterling on a scale that would have looked reckless to anyone who did not share their conviction. If they were wrong, the losses would have been brutal, but they had read the situation far more clearly than the government whose currency they were selling. And Soros was not alone. As the summer wore on, more and more traders around the world reached the same conclusion and placed the same bet. A one-way tide began to build against the pound. The trap was closing, and Britain could feel it. Throughout the summer of 1992, the pressure on the pound grew and grew. The Bank of England was forced to keep buying pounds, spending its foreign currency reserves to prop up the price and keep it inside the mechanism's band. Government ministers gave speech after speech insisting that the pound was strong, that devaluation was unthinkable, that Britain would never break its commitment. The Chancellor of the Exchequer, Norman Lamont, staked his reputation on it. The message was constant and absolute. The line will hold. But the markets have a cruel way of testing absolute promises. And in early September, they found a crack. It was not in Britain, it was in Italy. The Italian lira was another currency chained to the mark at a rate it could not sustain, and it broke first. The lira came under such ferocious pressure that Italy was forced to devalue. For the speculators, this was the smell of blood in the water. If one country could be forced out of the mechanism, the invincible system was not invincible after all. It was a row of dominoes. And every trader now turned to look at the biggest, weakest domino still standing, the British pound. The final act began with a single sentence. Just before the crisis broke, the president of the Bundesbank gave an interview. In it, he suggested, in careful central banker's language, that some currencies in the mechanism might still need to be realigned. He did not name the pound. He did not have to. To the markets, it read as an admission from the most powerful central bank in Europe that the defense of sterling might be hopeless. Germany, it seemed, was not going to ride to Britain's rescue. That was the signal. Overnight, the trickle of selling became a flood. By the morning of the 16th of September, the assault on the pound was total. What followed inside the British Treasury and the Bank of England that day was, by every account, a scene of mounting panic dressed in the calm language of officialdom. The pound was being hammered down toward the bottom of its permitted band. Below that floor, Britain would be in breach of its treaty obligations. So the Bank of England did the only thing it was designed to do. It began to buy pounds. Enormous quantities of pounds. It reached into the nation's foreign currency reserves and spent them by the billion, trying to soak up the tidal wave of selling and hold the price up by brute force. It was like trying to hold back the sea with a bucket. For every pound the bank bought, the speculators sold more. The reserves drained away hour by hour. By some estimates, the bank was spending around £2 billion an hour at the peak, and it was making no difference at all. The selling was simply too vast. Inside the Treasury, ministers and officials moved between crisis meetings with a growing sense of unreality. Among the advisors in the building that day were figures who would go on to shape British politics for the next 30 years, watching at close range as the full machinery of the state was overwhelmed by the market. Urgent messages were sent to Germany, asking the Bundesbank to cut its own interest rates even slightly, a gesture that might have taken some of the pressure off the pound. The answer that came back amounted to no. Germany had its own inflation to fight, and it would not weaken that fight to rescue a neighbour's currency. Britain was alone. And each time the Bank of England released another wave of reserves into the market, the price of the pound barely twitched. Billions were absorbed as though they were pocket change. It was the financial equivalent of firing shell after shell into thick fog and hearing nothing at all come back. So the government reached for its second weapon, the interest rate. Remember, high interest rates are supposed to make a currency more attractive to hold. If you raise the reward for holding pounds, in theory, people will want to buy them. That morning, the government raised interest rates from 10% to 12%. A huge increase, announced in the middle of a working day, an emergency measure meant to shock the markets into believing Britain would defend the pound at any cost. And the markets did not blink. The pound did not recover. The selling did not stop. The traders had done their arithmetic, and they had reached a conclusion that turned out to be devastatingly correct. They did not believe the British government would actually keep interest rates that high, because doing so would destroy an economy already in recession. The rate rise was a bluff, and everyone at the table could see the cards. So a few hours later, the government did something almost without precedent. It announced a second rate rise on the same day. Interest rates would go to 15%. In the space of a single afternoon, the cost of borrowing in Britain had been driven up by half, from 10 to 15%, a level that would have crushed businesses and homeowners across the entire country if it had lasted. It is worth pausing on what that would have meant in ordinary lives. Millions of British families held mortgages whose monthly payments rose and fell directly with interest rates. To push those rates to 15% and to hold them there would have meant a wave of missed payments, repossessions, and broken households, on top of a recession that was already biting hard. The government knew this. The markets knew that the government knew it, and that shared knowledge was precisely why the bluff failed. A threat is only ever as strong as the willingness to carry it out, and everyone in the market could see that Britain could not possibly live with 15% interest rates for any length of time. The weapon the government kept reaching for was one it could never actually afford to fire. And still, the pound did not move. The markets looked at a government raising rates toward levels that would cause an economic catastrophe, and they simply did not believe it could hold. The second rise was not a show of strength. It was the flailing of a state that had run out of options. Everyone watching understood the truth. This was not the sound of a line holding. It was the sound of a line breaking. By the evening, it was over. Inside the Treasury, the recognition finally set in that the battle was lost, that no amount of money and no level of interest rate was going to turn back a market this large and this certain. And so, that night, the Chancellor Norman Lamont walked out to face the cameras and admitted defeat. He announced that Britain was suspending its membership of the exchange rate mechanism. The pound was cut loose. The second rate rise to 15% was cancelled before it ever took effect. The great experiment was finished. Britain had been driven out of the system it had joined with such confidence just 2 years before. The mechanism had promised stability and discipline. What it delivered was the most humiliating financial defeat in modern British history. Now came the reckoning, and the numbers are worth stating plainly because they are staggering. The Treasury later estimated that the failed defence of the pound had cost the British taxpayer around £3.3 billion. That was the money burned in a single day, trying to hold up a price the market had already condemned. Some of that loss came from the reserves spent buying pounds that were instantly worth less. It was, in effect, a fortune set on fire in the space of an afternoon. And on the other side of the trade stood George Soros. When the pound was finally cut loose, it fell sharply, exactly as he had predicted. He closed his position, buying back the cheap pounds he had sold high, and the profit was reported to be around $1 billion. $1 billion from one bet in a matter of days. It made him a legend. The newspapers gave him a title that would follow him for the rest of his life. The man who broke the Bank of England. But here is where the story turns, and where it becomes something more interesting than a simple tale of national humiliation. Because in the strangest twist of all, Black Wednesday may have been the best thing to happen to the British economy in a generation. Think about what actually happened the day after. Freed from the mechanism, Britain no longer had to defend an impossible exchange rate. The pound was allowed to fall to a level the market considered fair, which made British exports competitive again. And crucially, the government was finally free to do what its own economy had been begging for. It could cut interest rates. And it did, again and again, easing the burden on millions of homeowners and businesses. The result was remarkable. The recession lifted. Exports grew. Inflation stayed low. Britain entered one of the longest continuous stretches of economic growth in its modern history. Some economists took to calling it not Black Wednesday, but White Wednesday, because the humiliation had quietly set the stage for a recovery. The defeat had freed Britain from a cage it should never have entered. The figures of that recovery tell the story more honestly than any speech could. In the years that followed, unemployment, which had been climbing without relief, began to fall. Inflation, the very enemy the whole painful exercise had been designed to defeat, stayed low regardless, without any need for the cage of the mechanism to hold it down. The economy grew, quarter after quarter, in an expansion that would run for well over a decade. Almost everything the exchange rate mechanism had promised to deliver, Britain finally achieved only after being thrown out of it. As for Norman Lamont, the Chancellor who had staked his reputation on defending the pound to the very last, the day effectively ended his time at the Treasury, and he was moved out of the post within the year. He later remarked, with the dark humour of a man who had lived through it, that he had been heard singing in his bath the morning after the pound was set free, relieved beyond words that the impossible defence was finally over. Whether or not the story was ever quite true, it captured something real about that strange moment. To those who understood what had actually happened, the defeat felt less like a catastrophe than like the breaking of a long and dangerous fever. But if the economy recovered, the political damage never did. And this is the deepest and most lasting consequence of that single day. The governing Conservative Party had built its entire reputation on one promise above all others, that it, and only it, could be trusted to manage the economy. On the 16th of September, in front of the whole country, that reputation was destroyed in an afternoon. The public had watched the government spend billions of their money defending an indefensible position, raise interest rates twice in a panic, and then surrender anyway. The image of competence shattered, and it did not come back. It would be years before that party won a general election again, and many historians trace the beginning of its long fall directly to that day. There was one more consequence, quieter, but perhaps the most important of all. The trauma of Black Wednesday burned itself so deeply into the British political memory that it shaped the country's relationship with Europe for decades. When the time came, years later, to consider whether Britain should give up the pound entirely and adopt the single European currency, the euro, the memory of that day hung over the entire debate. Britain had tried once to lock its currency to the continents. It had ended in disaster. That memory was one of the reasons Britain kept the pound and kept it to this day. So, what are we to make of it all? A government that walked knowingly into a trap, a currency defended to the point of ruin. A single trader who read the situation more clearly than an entire nation's treasury and was rewarded with $1 billion. And a defeat that turned, against all expectation, into a recovery. The lesson of Black Wednesday is the oldest lesson in finance, and it is one that the powerful relearn in every generation. A price that is set by politics rather than reality is a promise waiting to be broken. You can defend it with speeches. You can defend it with reserves. You can defend it with interest rates high enough to frighten a nation. But you cannot defend it forever, because on the other side of that promise stands the entire weight of the global market, patient and unsentimental, waiting to find out what your money is truly worth. Britain found out on a Wednesday in September. The bill came to £3.3 billion, and the man who sent it walked away a billionaire. Sources for this account include the official records and later testimony surrounding the United Kingdom's withdrawal from the exchange rate mechanism, contemporary reporting by the BBC, the Financial Times, and the Times of London, the published estimates of the Treasury on the cost of the intervention, and the widely reported accounts of the Quantum Fund's position given by George Soros and Stanley Druckenmiller in the years that followed.